I want I want to begin by reading you a short paragraph from a letter by Seneca, a celebrated Roman philosopher and statesman. In this paragraph, Seneca discusses slavery, a central institution in ancient Roman society. He writes, "Remember, if you please, that the man you call slave sprang from the same seed, enjoys the same daylight, breathes like you, lives like you, dies like you. You can as easily conceive him a free man as he can conceive you a slave. The essence of my teaching is this: treat your inferior as you wish your superior to treat you." Seneca's letter on slavery is striking because while he movingly exhorts us to recognize and respect the human dignity of a slave, Seneca is not advocating the abolition of slavery, not at all. He sees nothing wrong with slavery as an institution. In other words, he approaches slavery as a moral and personal question of how we should treat people who appear inferior to us. He presents his views on slavery here in explicit contrast to those of Aristotle, who had famously defended the institution of slavery by arguing that some people were natural slaves without the mental capacity for self-rule. Seneca clearly rejects this idea of inborn inequality. According to him, all humans, including slaves, are entitled to the same respect and dignity. They must not be beaten or raped, for example. At the same time, Seneca does not see slavery itself as a political problem at all. That is, a question concerning the justice of human organizations and institutions. When philosophers discuss justice, they commonly distinguish between these two aspects of justice. On the one hand, we can frame justice as an ethical problem confronting an individual person. So how do I, as an individual, act in a just manner in relation to other people? On the other hand, we can frame the problem of justice as a social or political question. So what kind of social, economic, and political institutions, organizations, and practices are just? The example of Seneca should make clear, however, that most of us would deem the purely ethical question about justice as partial, superficial, or even meaningless if we do not address the socio-political question of justice at all. In other words, no matter how well I treat the slave in terms of justice, it seems irrelevant as long as I don't also try to somehow act towards the abolition of slavery. Many political philosophers would claim that justice is the most important virtue of social and political institutions, just as truth is the most important virtue of scientific theories. So laws and institutions, no matter how efficient and well arranged, should be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. Now, with this in mind, let us now think about the particularly acute contemporary debate on justice, namely the debate on climate justice. Human-induced climate change is arguably the most serious environmental problem facing us today. Based on the available climate science, there's no doubt that it presents an existential threat in the sense of threatening the continued existence of human civilization. The safe limit for atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations established by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, namely 450 ppm, will be reached in less than 10 years at current emission rates. Many important climate scientists have contended, however, that the safe limit was actually closer to 350 ppm, a level we already overshot in 1988, which is why we are experiencing many of the predicted effects of climate change much earlier than anticipated. If we do not act quickly and decisively to mitigate climate change, millions of people are going to be displaced, suffer hunger, water shortages, and diseases due to drought, flooding, wildfires, and superstorms that will increase significantly, both in strength and frequency. Climate change mitigation introduces complex questions of justice, however. And the term climate justice refers to the idea that all our proposed solutions to the climate emergency must include considerations of justice. We need to pose questions about the kinds of social and political actions, arrangements, and organizations that would be just in the face of the climate emergency. So what kind of policies, for example, would serve climate justice in allocating resources and responsibilities fairly? When we talk about human-induced climate change, we often use the terms human and humanity as if all of us were equally responsible for this problem. But this is patently false, no matter how we slice the pie. If we focus on the wealth of individual emitters, the richest 1% of the people emit about twice as much greenhouse gases as the whole bottom half of the global population. And while it's true that there are both high and low emitters in every country, the disparities between the global north and south are nevertheless striking. While the average North American, for example, emits CO2 at the rate of 17 tons per capita, the carbon emissions of sub-Saharan Africa are barely 1 ton per capita. While such calculations bring to stark relief the disparities in responsibility for climate change, framing the question of climate justice in a framework that focuses on individual emissions can also be seriously misleading. The focus on individual emissions and consequently on the moral righteousness of our individual conduct often means that we are encouraged to seek solutions to climate change through green consumer choices. To give just some trivial examples, instead of using plastic straws, fashionable cocktail bars now serve drinks with paper straws and ask us to dry our hands with electric hand dryers instead of using paper towels. As many environmentalists have pointed out, this kind of framing of the problem might make us feel virtuous, but it does next to nothing to solve the problem of climate change. Importantly, it also stops us from understanding or even seeing clearly the problem of climate justice. To return to the example of Seneca, it's a bit like believing that justice means saying thank you to the slave you have bought to work for you. I want to make clear that I'm not suggesting here that ethical problems pertaining to our individual conduct are not important. They most certainly are. If we are interested in justice, we need to ask how I, as an individual, should act in a just manner in the face of climate change and what moral responsibilities I have, not only to the people around me, but to future generations, towards natural environments, the planet, and non-human animals. These are all vitally important questions that we need to pose to ourselves. but to really construct a compelling picture of what climate justice would mean, individual moral conduct must be placed within a broader structural, economic, and historical context. We must recognize that climate change is essentially a structural or a systemic problem caused by an economic system that is based on constant compound growth, profit maximization, and disregard for environmental limits. It's the direct result of an inherent conflict between the maintenance of ecosystems and the biosphere on the one hand, and on the other, the kind of rapid, unbounded economic growth that global capitalism requires. Moreover, we cannot understand or assess climate justice today without considering world economic and political history. Even if we are only waking up to it now, climate change is the result of roughly 200 years of accumulated emissions. Countries that have been powering their economies with fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution have emitted about 70% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are now changing the climate. These are, to a large extent, the same countries that are already responsible for the exploitative legacy of imperialism. Wealth also offers a significant measure of protection against the adverse effects of climate change, such as food and water shortages, extreme heat waves, and floods. In other words, climate change poses a daunting challenge to justice because the poor people least responsible for the problem are often the people suffering most from its harmful consequences. When we bring into focus the systemic and historical nature of climate change, then our questions about climate justice must also look strikingly different. Iris Marion Young, a philosopher who has thought deeply about the ethics of structural problems, develops the idea of what she calls structural injustice. She defines structural injustice by writing that structural injustice exists when social processes put large groups of people under systemic threat of domination or deprivation of the means to develop and exercise their capacities. Structural injustice is a kind of moral wrong distinct from the wrongful actions of individual agents. Structural injustice occurs as a consequence of many individuals and institutions acting to pursue their particular goals and interests, for the most part within the limits of accepted rules and norms, but which nevertheless cause serious harm to others. Now, following this definition, climate change is a structural injustice. It's a human-induced process that puts large groups of people under systemic threat of deprivation. Climate change is also a consequence of many individuals and institutions acting to pursue their particular economic goals and interests, for the most part within the limits of the law, but the compound effect of their actions results in catastrophic consequences for the environment and the people who depend on it. A significant aspect of Young's theory is the idea that structural injustices must entail a new understanding of moral responsibility. According to Young, moral responsibility must follow from our relationship to unjust structures and is relative to our position within them. So her key contention is that those who contribute by their actions to structural processes with unjust outcomes share responsibility for the injustice. This claim stands in sharp contrast to our traditional way of understanding legal and moral responsibility. We usually think that in order to bear responsibility for a harm, a person must have directly caused the harm with intent and knowledge of the likely consequences of their actions. Young argues that such an understanding of moral responsibility is inadequate for understanding our responsibility for structural injustices, however, because structural injustice is not directly caused by any one person, it's not intended, and when many people act within social structures, they often do not know exactly what the consequences of their actions will be. So Young's new model of responsibility argues for collective political responsibility, which is shared by all people connected to structural injustice. Our responsibility in relation to structural injustice means that we have an obligation to join with others who share that responsibility in order to transform the structural processes that make their outcome, processes to make their outcomes less unjust. So ordinary people's responsibility for climate change, understood as a structural injustice, entails coming to see oneself as part of a broader project for political and economic transformation. We have a moral obligation to act together to transform the structural processes that have brought it about, because these structures do not exist without us, but are reinforced and reproduced by our everyday actions. This form of responsibility thus involves calling attention to how our collective actions culminate in harms and presenting and promoting feasible alternatives. For example, we must pressure our governments to institute new laws and economic policies, as well as imagining and experimenting with new ways of thinking and living. Engaging in such actions should be recognized not just as a moral obligation in the face of structural injustice, but also as a politically empowering collective practice. To conclude, I want to come back to Seneca one more time. I want to suggest that the limitations of his thought can not only help us think through what a compelling account of climate justice might look like, but also help to clarify one simple but important idea that motivates my talk, and I think this series of talks more generally. Our understanding of justice matters. Many people interested in social and environmental problems think that what we most need is action, useful, effective, practical interventions, and that posing philosophical questions about justice, for example, is just idle armchair speculation. What the example of Seneca shows, however, is that if we are unable to think of slavery as a political problem, if we cannot even see it as a political problem, a problem that's concerned with the justice of our social, economic, and political institutions and practices, then we cannot even begin to act for its abolition. In other words, the way we conceive and conceptualize social institutions, practices, and human relations has direct consequences for our ability to organize politically and bring about change. Science and technology alone cannot solve the serious environmental, social, and economic problems we face. We also need philosophical debate on the desired ends and the just means by which our societies and ways of life need to be changed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Johanna Oksala. That was really inspiring and refreshing as well, refreshing point of view. We still have 3 minutes for question and answer. If you have questions, you can ask directly to Dr. Johanna. Also, just want to announce that our live transcript, you can access it through Zoom.